I just felt sorry for them. I didn't look at appearance, I looked at these animals are dying. And Ted obviously put them on a course of medication, but I learned that visit the importance of proper nutrition. And Ted had started to experiment with the first variants of pellets. And they didn't smell good, birds didn't really like them, but we played with them. I would grind up vegetables and mix it in. And those birds slowly recovered. They were deformed, but they overcame their calcium deficiency, they overcame their vitamin A deficiency, and they bred. And they were extremely productive. And I think it was a way of them saying, thank you for saving our lives. But it was those birds that said, pay attention to diet. Because Lefevre believed that most of the birds, and this is well documented, most of the birds are dying from dietary deficiencies.
So so you're basically telling me that at this point in time, what were they feeding? They weren't feeding pellet.
So at that time, the standard was a Parrot mix.
Like
Sunflower seeds, peanuts, chili peppers, corn, buckwheat, etc. That was the standard. And everybody fed some apple and some grapes and some banana. And if you were adventuresome, you would feed endive or some of the greens. That was the diet. But 80% of the birds that were dying from dietary deficiencies. They weren't getting what they needed. And I think that set the course that I have followed my whole life. And the course was that diet is the tip of the pyramid. And I see bird keeping as a pyramid. The base is housing. The tip is diet. And then over time, my position has changed. I feed pellets. And people that tell me, oh, parrots are so unnatural. Well, wait a minute. Where do sunflower seeds come from? Where does the safflower come from?
Yeah, I was going to ask you, all these things that occurred over time where people started, putting these things in mixes, how do you feel about a lot of those unnatural, where are sunflowers from?
I think sunflowers come from North America. Safflower comes from, I don't know, Carlos, can you Google where sunflower seeds come from? I think when you do research, nothing that we feed these birds is natural. Anybody that tells you, oh, feed them flowers, feed them sprouted mung beans because they're natural. No, they are not natural. They are not part of a wild parrot's diet. Wild parrots, when you look at them, and I've been fortunate. I've seen 87, 88% of the 400 parrot species in nature. When you look at them, they eat fruit green. And why do they eat it green? They don't want to compete with fruit bats and kinkajou or with monkeys or with any of these other animals.
We've talked about that before, how parrots have evolved to consume starchier. They're not as ripe.
So they need fat, they need protein, they need carbohydrates. They don't need sugars.
Yeah.
In fact, I just lectured in Bali, and one of the points that I stressed was that aggression in male cockatoos increases as you feed them sugary foods, grapes, bananas, apples. I was in Siberia, and there was a wild apple tree. And, I've gotten sick many times because I eat everything the parrots eat. I want to see what it's like.
Yeah.
And I thought, man, this stuff is astringent. I spit this. I said, what crap is this? And then, you go to a supermarket in the US and we're consuming apples that are sugar packets. There's no comparison to what they would feed on. So we're feeding fruits that have evolved for the human palate. The more sugary it is, the tastier it is.
So what fruits would you recommend in that case?
I avoid feeding fruits. If you do feed berries, they tend to have a low glycemic count. Feed Granny Smith apples. But let's focus on vegetables where there's good nutrition. Let's look at American or yellow sweet potato. Let's look at carrots. Let's look at broccoli. Let's look at pumpkin, squash. Let's feed things that are rich in beta carotene.
That's a huge, I think since the dawn of like movies and all these things, people look at a parrot and they think tropical, they think fruit, they think all these things, and they don't realize that.
Oh, and then you've got everyone that's become an internet expert. I mean, I get approached. I probably answer 50 questions a day that people reach out to me. And, oh, but so-and-so told me that I should feed my birds bananas because it's very good. So we're talking about, in that case, it was an eclectus. The eclectus had yeast. They couldn't control the yeast. And I said, well, wait a minute, are you not looking at the fact that you're feeding the yeast with this banana? And where did this expert? Oh, I contacted her on the internet. Well, what knowledge does she have? You know, when all of these people that become self-professed experts, you ask them, how many birds have you bred? How many birds have you studied in nature? What makes you qualified to dictate this diet or that you've got to give them flowers or sprouts or where? Give me some background. If you've told me I've bred palm cockatoos, I've bred hyacinths, I've bred toco toucans, I've bred bali minas, and I've bred 3 generations, I'll shut up and say, you know what?
Did we fact check the sunflowers there?
Yeah, so it says Africa, mainly Africa, Middle East, and Asia as well.
So, you know, it's not growing in a tropical forest in South America. They do grow, they're an introduced crop. The wild sunflowers are very different from the cultivated varieties, which are high fat. So it doesn't matter, you know, and we're regressing to the original question, is, you know, whether we feed seeds, whether we feed sprouts, whether we feed fruits, whether we feed vegetables or pellets, none of that is native to
So me and you have talked about
their
it.
habitat.
You've told me that you know, we can't go to a store and buy a bunch of unripened fruits, and the best remedy to that, correct me if I'm wrong, is you buy a vegetable that, you know, is high in beta carotene. You buy these vegetables that are good for them, and it's the closest we can get to replicating their natural.
So when we look at, for example, red-bellied macaws, I sat, when I was 16 years old, I raised tropical fish, and I still raise tropical fish. I spent a summer in Manaus, in the middle of the Amazon, and the red-bellied macaws were feeding on Mauritia flexuosa, burichi palm. They call it aguaje in Peru, they call it moriche in other countries in Latin America. It's a palm tree that is extremely rich in beta carotene. In fact, when you take a red-bellied macaw and you don't feed it this palm fruit, the cheeks that are normally orangish yellow turn white. The birds don't do well. They begin to suffer from the atherosclerosis, etc. So what does that teach us? The birds have evolved to require high beta carotene.
That's interesting that you talk about that you're observing these birds in their natural habitat. I mean, I find that when anyone that I talk to with experience, for the most part, they have experience in captivity. But you pioneered some of the, you know, some of the things that we do in aviculture. What's it like being in the middle of the Amazon and looking at, you know, these animals?
Look, so we need to be open-minded and say, if the birds have evolved to occupy a certain niche, if they've occupied to evolve on eating certain elements, how can we adapt that? And I'll tell you where a lot of my views come from, and they come from the forest. When we were hand-rearing Amazons and macaws in the early 1980s, the standard was monkey chow, peanut butter, and baby food. You whipped it up and you fed it. But we didn't know whether the chicks, they looked good, but were we meeting their needs? So I spent 3 summers going to South America, having people climb trees, take crop contents, lower them to me, lower the chicks. I would take crop contents and I would have them analyzed. And the dominant factor was high-fat foods. The birds were selecting foods that were rich in beta-carotenes, proteins, and fats. So I came back and I had growth data of chicks that were being parent reared, because we would take them down. I would take crop contents, I would measure, weigh, and they would be returned to the nest. So I had data week in, week out of many of these chicks. And I realized that we weren't providing enough fat. We weren't providing enough vitamin A. That's why we were having such high incidences of candida in the chicks in the nursery. That's why we were seeing stunting. We need to extrapolate from nature. Yes, birds eat pods. Yes, birds eat flowers. Yes, birds eat fruit. But the fruit they eat is green. You know, look at the internet.
Seeds. They eat palm seeds.
They eat palm seeds because they have fat. They provide the fat that they need. In Puerto Rico, there's been a lot of work, and the Puerto Rican parrot is probably the most studied of all parrots. And when you look at it, its nesting coincides with the fruiting of the Prostia montana, the endemic palm, which is very rich in fat. Why? Because the likelihood of that chick surviving is greatest if it has fat. At my house, and you know my dusky conures and my half moons, for 3-4 years, I selected chicks and I fed some on high fat, some on low fat diets, and then I set them up, and the birds that were fed a high fat diet as chicks matured faster, reproduced faster, showed better bone density than those that were fed on a low fat diet.
Well, that's applicative to South American species regarding macaws, conures, and then it gets a little bit different with the Amazons. And you know, I know they're South American, but where does the diet change between species?
Amazons require fat when they're breeding.
Okay.
You know, the same diet should not be applied year-round. It should vary depending on seasons.
Yeah, we talk about that in breeding season. You know, you increase fat intake. It gets a little bit colder when they're gonna start, and then they also need that. You've told me before, the birds, when they're gonna breed, they breed with surplus.
So there has to be, look, birds breed not because they want to ingratiate us. They breed because they have a biological clock that says as a species, you need to replace yourself. Mm-hmm. When do they replace themselves? When food is bountiful. Why is it that with parrots, when there's high fat, high protein, they produce more males? Because then it's carrying on of the genes. It's the biggest, most powerful male can be the next one to reproduce. Mm-hmm. And when there is drought and poor conditions, they tend to produce more females because the survival of the species is at stake. A female can mate with any male, but a female will also, in times of bounty, select the best male. She wants the greatest probability of success. And this thing that parrots mate for life is nonsense. There's been work where birds have been wing tagged. They put a tag, and Ian Rowley was instrumental in doing this work in a book called The Galah. And he found that these things were divorcing. That, you know, even though the male and the female survived from one year to the next, maybe they selected new mates the following year.
Does that apply to like all species, or?
So
like
it's much more common than we think. When I had a house on Normandy Isle here in Miami Beach, I wing tagged some severe macaws. There's a huge feral population. You put a tag that's got a number,
okay,
and you can spot it with binoculars. And we found that birds would periodically change partners and then come back. So maybe, you know, XY bred with AB one year, and then the next year XY bred with EF.
So the idea that they
and then they would come back. So they didn't pair for life as people think.
That's what everyone's assuming, that they pair for life. But to go back to what you were saying about diet, so do you feel that, because this is for all our viewers that ask, you know, what should I feed my bird, what do you think? It varies by species, you know, especially regions. It varies by season, so it's not just a one size fits all.
Let me give you things that I would feed and things I would not feed. Avoid celery, celery tends to be highly contaminated with bacteria. I was recently dealing with a very prominent eclectus breeder, and she sent me culture results. And I immediately said, "You're feeding celery." "Oh, how do you know?" "Because your birds are full of bacteria, gram-negative bacteria." Avoid celery. It's not a clean vegetable. Avoid sugary fruits. Focus on leafy green vegetables. Focus on beta-carotene-rich vegetables. Clean your tubers. Clean your carrots. Clean your sweet potato. Clean your foods that you're going to feed that grow underground and can be contaminated. Wash all your foods. Steam lightly steam your sweet potato, your carrot, your pumpkin. We want to break the fibers. If you break those fibers, so it's like this, right? If you break it, the birds can access the beta carotene much easier.
How often should they be feeding veggies and fruits a week?
I think fruits, if you're going to feed fruits, you feed Granny Smith apples, you can feed cranberries, you can feed any of the berries. Avoid banana, grapes. Those things they're sugar packets.
Should it be like an everyday thing?
When you look at Google photos of Amazon parrots eating bananas in the wild, and they're eating green bananas, you'll see a big bunch of bananas. The ripe ones are at the bottom. They ripen from the bottom up. The birds are eating the top ones. They're not eating the ripe ones.
What do you differentiate between an Amazon and a cockatoo? Like, what would be the difference between a macaw, let's say a macaw, a blue and gold macaw, and an umbrella cockatoo?
So I haven't finished on diet. Avoid sprouts unless you can wash them and you can be assured that they are clean. Sprouts tend to grow bacteria. And look, guys, I'm not stating this just out of a whim. I'm stating this based on lab work, research, where you sprout seeds, you take cultures, you submit them to a lab that does a culture and sensitivity. And when you're growing, many gram-negative pathogens, yes, we don't know what the normal E. coli level is in a bird, but when it's heavy growth, that's not normal. When you're growing Salmonella, Klebsiella, Pseudomonas, these are things that are a concern. So, unless you can guarantee that your sprouts are super clean.
By sprouts, you mean like
germinated grains.
Germinated grains.
I would only feed them if I was very sure that they came from a clean source, if they were very well washed, if the birds were outdoors, if the climate was cool. I wouldn't feed them on a hot day. Because what's a bird going to do with a sprout? He's going to chew it up a little bit. And then that broken piece is going to begin to oxidize, and it's going to begin to grow bacteria. And that broken piece sits on top of all the others. So when they come back and feed, we've contaminated the entire batch. So, I feed pellets, and I feed the normal. I don't like the fruit blends. I feed 70% pellets. I feed 30% vegetables. And depending on the species, then this answers your question on macaws, I give nuts. And, I look at nuts that I know are not going to be an aflatoxin risk. Brazil nuts.
Peanuts, Brazil nuts.
Peanuts, avoid them. Use almonds, walnuts. These are good nuts, are healthy.
Yeah, people often ask, should it be a hard shell or should it be the shell?
The shell, if it's a big bird and can crack it, buy human grade nuts, give them in the shell. If it's a small kite, for example, he may not be able to crack a hard nut, so you would give them to him shell. So cockatoos, when you look at cockatoos in nature, and I'm talking white cockatoos, black cockatoos are a different story. Yellow-tailed black cockatoos require animal protein. They feed on grubs actively. Palm cockatoos have a high fat requirement. When we look at the white cockatoos, they tend to suffer from fatty liver. So you're not going to give them a fatty diet. You want to give them a diet lower in fat, but you can use, if you're breeding, to stimulate them.
That's for all
Some
our
nuts.
viewers that feed primarily seeds to their white cockatoos.
It's not healthy.
Something we're against. I wanted to ask you about, so we can kind of coincide with our viewers. What's your experience in terms of pets? I mean, Carlos, what was that question that people ask us all the time about?
Yeah, so most of the time people ask, what makes a better pet? Is it male or female? What are the differences in terms of gender, and it affects the personality of the bird? How do you feel about that?
So my take of pet ownership is probably different than most people. I don't believe that one gender can talk better than the other. That's nonsense. I believe that both gender can make great pets. With some species, like cockatoos, people tend to overly touch them, and they touch the males and they make them sexually active.
Yeah, they
They,
stimulate
they
their own
make them hormonal.
Yeah.
You don't want to be rubbing the vent of a male cockatoo because you're stimulating it. And people do this all the time. I have a Malucan at the house that the late Sam Backus, a vet here in Florida, called me and said, listen, I was brought this Malucan cockatoo. The lady wants me to euthanize it. I cannot euthanize this bird. Would you take it? I said, absolutely. What's wrong with it? He said, she consulted with one of these, internet experts. The bird was easily agitated, was clearly hormonally stimulated, and she said, "Oh, take the bird out and you rub it on the vent, and that will get the bird to calm down." Well, what it did, it agitated the bird, and the bird attacked her. She had to go through reconstructive surgery on her face. She's so freaked out that she wanted the bird euthanized.
Well,
It wasn't the bird's fault. It was the owner's fault for not questioning the source of the advice. There are areas that I don't recommend touching in a parrot. Let's focus on chest and head. We don't touch the vent, we don't touch the back, because those are sensitive points
It can stimulate
that stimulate. When a bird becomes, and many of these birds, even when you don't stimulate them, they still can become hormonal. You reduce the protein, you reduce the fat in their diet, you bathe them, you give them enrichment, you make sure that they have plenty of rest. You don't put the bird outside where it's going to be super exposed to photo period, and you take a cockatoo that is beginning to show some hormonal activity and you put it outside in spring, the growing daylight is going to add a greater stimulus. Suddenly you're touching it in the wrong spots. You're creating a monster. When we look at birds in rescues, male cockatoos are a common case. Why? Because the people don't understand.
have you ever seen a bird go after somebody? Have you ever witnessed a bird literally attack somebody?
Yes. I've been at this for so long. I've done lots of consulting. And I often walk away saying, I guess in 50 years I've learned nothing, and somebody that bought one bird is now an expert, and he or she knows everything.
That's the issue. Online, there's a lot of misinformation. People
There's
have,
tremendous misinformation. I always ask, question me. Question me on my credentials. What can I prove? And I can give you 5,000 names of people that have followed advice and have seen results. I think that we need to understand that when we buy these birds, they are not a human attachment with feathers. They are an individual being that thinks, that breathes, that must learn to evolve. Its personality must be independent. It is not a human with feathers. It is a bird. Last night, I'm an avid reader, and I was reading a book called Parrots and Elephants, and it was 1700s France. And there's a caption from an old ornithologist who described parrots as, independent, intelligent, hard-headed beings. And, I'm paraphrasing. the description because it was very long. But I thought, man, if they knew this in 1751, why is it that we've lost that knowledge today? Raise the bird so that the bird can learn to play on its own, can interact. Where you buy a bird is very important. You want that bird to experience being a bird first and foremost. You don't give somebody that has no experience a baby bird and say, here, finish weaning it. You know.
That's a question we get asked a lot. We get a lot of questions saying, can I hand feed it myself? And I think people don't understand
sensitivity of it.
Yeah, and the level of experience it takes to do something like that.
You need the bird to learn to be a bird. You need to learn to have him or her interact with other birds. You need to have that bird understand toys, enrichment. You need it to understand being alone. The novelty of bringing a bird home. People want to have it on their shoulders the whole time. They want to be cuddling. Well, the novelty wanes. When the novelty wanes, the bird is segregated. If this bird thinks he is a feathered human, he's going to scream. He's going to trash the cage. He's going to attack. You know, get the bird, play with it, set rules. When I look at parrots in the wild, and I learned this in 1976, the macaws would become active at 7:15 in the morning. At 6 p.m., they were back to sleep. And they nested right on the water where the Indian village that I stayed at was. So I would watch them go and I would watch them come back. They didn't spend all day interacting. You know, learn when you wake up the bird, teach the bird when it has to go to bed, cover the cage. If you've got a party, don't take the bird out. Oh, look at how cute it is. Understand that these are creatures of habit. And you want to teach good habits. When the bird behaves and does something good, praise it. They understand praise. When the bird misbehaves, the worst thing that you can do is theatrics. Oh, the bird is screaming. Look, stop, baby, stop. What have you done? You've just shown the bird that if he misbehaves, he's going to get, or she's going to get the attention that it wants.
People might need a lesson in psychology to understand positive and negative.
Enforcement, yeah.
Yeah, because you're screaming and you're starting a show when you want the bird not to do something, and it's like, that's interesting. I mean, that applies to anything, even with a kid. You can't pay attention to a tantrum.
No, you know, so enrichment to me is very important. And if you've used toys, and we were discussing before we came on the air on toys, do I believe toys play a role? Yes. But, you know, what do I want in a toy?
So here is an example.
Well, I don't want anything painted. And I was discussing an incident where I do consulting. And I had a series of cages painted, and I asked for certificates on metal content in the paint. And I was given these 2 certificates. Well, 2 weeks after the first birds went into these aviaries, they begin to show heavy metal toxicity. We x-ray, and they're full of heavy metal. It turned out the certificates were fake. The paint was full of lead. So what does that teach me? Avoid paint whenever. Try to use toys that have natural elements. If they use dyes, make sure they're vegetable dyes. I don't want something that's synthetic. Know the source. Know that it's not going to be contaminated with lead. And employ wherever you can natural enrichment.
Guys, enrichment, palm seeds, we can't stress it enough. Toys are great, you need to stimulate your bird, but at the end of the day, if you could get to the natural source, right, you know.
So, and then you know, look at toys or enrichment as enrichment, but after 3 days it becomes furniture.
Yeah.
So if you add a green coconut to a cage, and the birds have chewed on it, and they stop ignoring it, take it out after 3 days, or it's furniture.
Yeah.
When you take it out, you can bring it back at another stage. But 3 days is the rule. You know, and enrichment could be anything. It could be Royal Poinciana pods. It could be pine cones, it could be palm seeds. Obviously, we are blessed in Florida with all of these exotic trees that we grow here that we can use. You know, pandanus. You have many things that you can give your birds. They're wonderful.
What's how did you come about knowing that that those were possibilities, those things?
So it's watching parrots in the wild. You know, I was at the Taj Mahal in India, and there were ringnecks eating green royal poinciana pods. You know, I posted a photo, and somebody said, "Oh, they're poisonous." Well, if they were poisonous, there wouldn't have been as many ringnecks as there were flying around
Another
the Taj
internet
Mahal.
expert saying that they know that they're poisonous. Where are poinciana pods from?
Let me look it up.
So those ringnecks, I mean, you've told me not just ringnecks, but what is the deal with palm cockatoos and pandanus?
So it's part of their natural diet. You know, they eat those, and they eat what we called West Indian almond, Terminalia catapa. In India, they call it Indian almond. Everybody calls it, in Bali, they call it Bali beach almond. So everybody calls it.
Everyone claimed it differently.
Yeah.
What,
Eclectus will eat the leaves because they're rich in tannins.
in the West Indian almonds?
Yeah, they'll eat the leaves. I've seen them on Halmahera in the Moluccan Islands. I've seen Bosmerus eclectus eating dried West Indian almond, Terminalia catapa.
You told me an interesting story the other day.
I've seen them, hold on, just eating the dried leaves. So clearly they were absorbing the tannins. Go ahead.
You told me an interesting story the other day about St. Thomas Conyers and how they like, you keep mentioning that they do this stuff, they interact with their environment, and they do all these different things. What was that story you told me about the St. Thomas and how they nest? I think people don't understand how much that they have to do with the nature, the trees that are in their environment.
So, you know, parrots nest in the following cavities. Obviously, a tree cavity. They nest on the ground. They nest in caves. And they nest in termite mounds, and arboreal and terrestrial termite mounds. And termite mounds are used worldwide. Lovebirds use termite mounds in trees in Africa. Conures and Broderger's parakeets use termite mounds in the tropics. Amazons in South America use terrestrial termite mounds. Terrestrial termite mounds are used by golden-shouldered parrots in Australia. So many species utilize these. And what was interesting is that the St. Thomas conure, it's sort of like an arch. So they dig a hole and they create a tunnel, and then a nesting chamber, and then they leave for 3 weeks. So that it gives the termites a chance to seal the fracture, the opening that they've done. And so in order to get these birds to nest, I said, I've got to develop something. So I developed a nest that is like a C that's laying down. It's like this. And then I would fill it up with cork. It duplicated the nest, and I was able to get them to breed.
How'd you come up with cork?
Because it looked like termite mound, looks like cork.
Wow.
You know, I don't think my house insurance would have been happy if I would have brought a lot of termites.
Yeah, right.
You know, and added them to the nest.
That's crazy. Those are observations that people, our internet experts sometimes don't have the real life experience to.
I have a real, there's lots of good people out there that share good knowledge, but there are a lot of experts that are self-acclaimed that don't really have knowledge, and unfortunately they give wrong information. It creates a problem and it turns people away.
Like we get all the time, the males talk more, females talk less conversation.
When I ask this, I always tell people, okay, can you quantify that? I often hear that this Amazon parrot lived to be 180 years of age. Can you prove it to me? And many times they don't. And I often cite a case of a cockatoo that Arthur Alfred Prestwich was the secretary of the most prestigious avicultural journal, the Avicultural magazine. And at one point he wrote an article on longevity in parrots. And he cited a cockatoo that lived to be 120 years. And he said it had lived at London Zoo for all these years. Well, when you looked at the date when London Zoo was opened, the bird lived at London Zoo before London Zoo
even
existed.
existed.
You know, it was a field. So oftentimes when you look at data,
Got a question.
you know, they don't.
Yeah,
The bird is not
yeah.
180 years old or 100 years old. So that's a common misconception. That males talk better. Well, prove it to me.
I think people get one experience, and like you said, they get one thing, and they're like, oh, this must be the do-all, end-all. Just because you get one that talks a little bit more than the other doesn't mean that applies to everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, zoos have been in existence now for 200 years. When you look at records from zoos, for example, longevity records, and it was ISIS, International Species Inventory System, that subsequently became Species 360. When you look at their data, and you look at the work of Kuhn Brauer and some of these researchers that have gone back and have reviewed meticulous records, you know, it shows that these birds don't live to be the ages that people claim. And then when you look at birds that have a history of speaking, and there's several that are in the Guinness Book of World Records, doesn't necessarily say the sex. And in one case, for example, I was in Singapore and I was shown this male African gray that was such a great talker because he was a male, and I looked at the vet and I said, this is a female. Oh, no, sir, no, sir. 2 years later, I get a message from the lady saying, oops, you were right, it's a female, laid eggs.
Oof, that's crazy. I think we have the Q&A coming
Yeah,
up
I have a
now,
good
so you
question
guys
here.
can go ahead and
Yeah.
ask a few questions.
So I have Sydney asking, how much is too much for toys in enrichment? How do you maneuver that?
So you don't fill the cage, you vary it. So what you do is you rotate things. You know, give a couple of things, leave them 2 or 3 days, and make it fun for the birds. You know, you just don't throw a handful of palm seeds on the floor of the cage. You know, wrap them up in a ball of paper. Let the bird dig through it. Make it curious. Make it interesting for the bird. So you give 2 or 3 pieces and you vary them all the time.
So variety is key then, not
Key.
not quantity.
Remember, 3-day rule. After 3 days, it becomes furniture.
Yeah.
What other questions?
You got some people there
Yeah.
asking some stuff.
You know, so with enrichment, vary it. And it doesn't mean that you have to discard it. You can put it away and use it a month, 2 months later.
You can freeze it.
You can freeze it, you know, you can wash the toys, hang it someplace,
Yeah.
and bring it back. You know, make it fun.
How important is like bathing? I get that question a lot too.
So birds should be bathed daily, they bathe daily in nature. It's a good way of maintaining feather quality. It's a good way of reducing powder downs.
Do you recommend like a spray bottle, or should they bathe on their own out of like an extra?
You know, if the bird enjoys it, you can take them into the shower with you. If the bird doesn't like it, a cloud, a mist. If the bird is outdoors and it's hot, you know, use a fog mister. Turn it on every day. Give the birds a chance to bathe.
You would experiment with the
Yeah, the
different
one
methods.
size fits all conversation. I think it goes back to that.
And, you know, one of the things that I want to touch on is cold tolerance. When we get winter, everybody freaks out. Oh, it's going to drop to 60 degrees. My birds are going to freeze. I remember 8 years ago, I was in Russia, and I was visiting a collection, and the macaws were outside. It was 4 degrees below zero, They had a heated shelter. The water bowl was frozen. The guy chipped it out, poured fresh water, the macaws came and paid. They have incredible cold tolerance.
Wow.
You know, in fact, I think that more diseases are experienced in warm weather than in cooler weather. Across Europe, aviaries, you know, birds are outdoors.
Yeah.
I've been in Denmark, and I've looked at a nest of red-tailed blacks with a chick inside when I had a parka on, gloves, and I was shivering away. You know, they can tolerate the cold. Down comforters and down jackets. It's feather down,
Yeah.
you know.
I mean, they come from varying parts of the world, so it makes sense.
Yeah, so Sydney asked another question. He said, how should we go about integrating a bird into a family? Should the bird be introduced like to all the family members? Should it be little by little?
I always tell people when they bring in a bird home, have as many people come in contact with it. Make sure that the bird experiences different people. You know, if you have children, supervise them, because a bite of a parrot can do harm. And understand there are certain species that may not be suitable for a household with children.
I get that question a lot too. So people ask me like, what species do they recommend? You know, if you have kids.
If you've got
You know.
kids and you want to get started, to me there's nothing better than a cockatiel. After a cockatiel, I would look at a dusky conure. After a dusky conure, I would say a Myers parrot or a Pioneer parrot. You work up. You don't buy a scarlet macaw for a child.
Especially if you're like a first-time bird owner.
Yes.
Yeah.
Understand bird behavior. Understand bird care. You know, do some background work. Do some research. You don't buy a car by just saying, oh, you know, I like that car. You're going to research it.
Yeah.
You don't buy a house without researching it. Make sure your bird is tested for some of the common diseases. You know, testing is an insurance policy. Doesn't mean that the bird will never get sick. It doesn't mean that the bird will never die. It just means that it's clear of certain diseases. If you have a bird in your home, you're not going to bring in another bird unless it's been disease tested.
Correct.
It's-
Somebody's asking there about polyomavirus. They're asking you like, kind of how difficult it is.
So, I believe we are seeing 3 significant outbreaks worldwide. Circle virus, or PBFD. It used to be that it was a disease of young birds. It's now impacting adult birds that have been in captivity for a very long time. Dr. Susan Clubb, who's one of the most prominent vets in the U.S., and I were working on a series of birds that we've known since the 1970s that suddenly went into quarantine with some ringnecks that were circle virus positive, and the Amazons caught it.
Wow.
So that's one disease that you test. Polyoma is one that you want to exclude from a nursery. You want to exclude from an aviary, and it's testable. And you can vaccinate. I highly recommend Eclectus and kites and some other species getting vaccinated. And then the third is PDD, which we know very little about. PDD is a growing threat. And there is no vaccine for it. They're working on a circle virus PBFD vaccine. So, you know, these are diseases that you test and you want to keep out of your home or your aviary.
Do we have any questions coming up on our Instagram live there?
Yeah, so I have one here. He's talking about the high sugar content of carrots and sweet potato. Are people, people are concerned about that because their birds, they don't know if the metabolic rates, is that okay?
So there's fibers, and there are different types of sugars.
Yeah.
You don't want to feed a sugary, you take a bite from an apple, or you take a bite from a carrot. Your own palate will tell you, geez, the apple's got a lot more sugar. you take a bite from a sweet potato and you take a bite from a banana, and there's a difference. You know, many things have sugars. It's the fibers that come with it, the good nutritional elements that come with it. So, you know, everything's been bred to be, well, all the fruits and vegetables have been produced to be palatable to humans.
It tastes better. Yeah.
To taste better. But within that, you select. Look, you know, people always say, well, my birds prefer fruit. And I always say, okay, you know, give me a bowl full of candy and give me a plate of vegetables. What am I going to oscillate to? I'm going to oscillate towards a chocolate.
Of course.
The birds are going to do the same. Oh, they're going to eat the fruit because it's sweeter and easier to digest and juicier than a bowl full of vegetables. But once you get them
Used to it, yeah.
you know, and there's lots and lots of blood tests that show, you know, birds on a vegetable diet are far healthier than on a fruit diet.
That's interesting topic. I mean, people don't understand that it's like with a kid. If you give him junk food, he's gonna want junk food. Like if you just put a bunch of seeds in a bowl full of pellets, I'm assuming the bird is gonna gravitate towards the seeds.
We were just discussing where, you know, you fill a bowl full of pellets with seeds, the bird's gonna eat the seeds.
Mm-hmm.
You know, always choose the junk food over.
Yes.
Which is why you do.
You know, and when I say no fruit, there are obviously exceptions. Lorries require a fruit-based nectar. You know, they need.
Well, what fruits do you recommend for lorries? Because we have a lot of.
So I like
clients.
papaya. I recommend papaya. I like mango. I like guava. I prefer the tropical rather than the temperate fruits. When you see pomegranate is a great one for lorries. Palm cockatoos love pomegranate. They love broccoli. So there are things that they really like. And, you know, one good thing about pomegranate is that it takes them a long time to go through.
You give it whole, or how do you give that?
Oh, you just break it, you cut it, break it.
Pomegranate's new to me. I heard about hibiscus flowers.
The problem with hibiscus is that they tend to wilt real fast. So, you know, pussy willow, if you live in the north, is a great enrichment. Pine. You know, people tell me, oh, I live in northern Europe, I have no green plants. Wait a minute, you've got pine trees growing in your yard. You've got willow. Cut some of the branches and feed it to your birds.
Interesting.
So you think about having the same, you know, 2 or 3 birds in the same cage. Because I always recommend my clients to, you know, have a cage per bird so they don't fight for resources or anything like that.
Because they're going to fight. There's always dominance.
Yeah.
You know, there's a bird that's going to be, and people say, oh, no, dominance, he doesn't. Study birds in the wild. When I was at Aripuana, it was always one particular blue and gold that had one yellowtail feather that perched up on top of the tree, and all the others below. In 1980, I spent a month in Western Victoria in Australia. And there were wild sulfur-crested cockatoos, and it was one particular bird. They fed a lot on the ground, so their feathers would become stained with gray from the ground, from feeding on the ground. One particular bird always perched up highest. He was a sentinel. He would warn when people were coming because they were shooting him, they were a pest. So this particular bird was a lookout. They eventually shot him, and another one immediately took that position.
Wow.
So that when people say, oh no, there's no dominancy, there's no hierarchy, it's not true.
How do you feel about intelligence in birds? You told me in particular the goffins are very intelligent.
Yeah, I mean, I was just in Bali, and one of the researchers was lecturing on dolphins that they now call Tannenbarkarella. There's been this earthquake of changing names, which to me cause only confusion. I'm working on a cockatoo book, and I hope to have it done in the next few years. And I'm using standard names. It isn't Ceram cockatoo for Moluccan cockatoos. It's not Tannenbarkarella for the Goffin's cockatoo. To me, that is one of the smartest. There is in fact, there was just a movie released on a Florida researcher, Jen, and I just spent some time working with her, and she got a Goffin that has learned to use an iPad, and he'll call her. And he lets her know when he's healthy, when he's not. And the movie was just released at a film festival. I don't know the name of the movie, but it features parrots that communicate with their owners. And the lead star is a Goffin's cockatoo.
Interesting. Everyone assumes that African greys, I mean, I'm not saying that one is smarter than the other, but that's the consensus. African grey is the smartest parrot there is.
I've bred greys, I've had pets. I think that a Goffin is the absolute smartest.
That's a hot take.
They are, there's some work done on one of the Tanimbar Islands, and they were finding that the birds were eating cassava root, and they would dig the ground, and they would expose the cassava and chew it and wait for it. I know of one researcher who's working on, and she locked the cage because Goffins are escape artists with a padlock. And we come back and the bird is using a stick, trying to stick it in to see if he could pick the padlock.
Well,
that shows you the level of intelligence.
What do you think separates the Goffin from like the rest of the smaller cockatoos, like the lesser, like those types of cockatoos?
I think Goffins are much smarter. They were a terribly underappreciated bird. The numbers that were exported were massive. The numbers that came into the U.S. were massive. They were cheap, and nobody wanted them. No one realized their huge potential until now. And unfortunately, they're not that commonly bred anymore.
I have somebody here asking, Sean Marte, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly. He said, "Hi Tony, any thoughts about replicating diet for captive lories and lorikeets? Is high sugar diet good for them?"
So, I like they need some sugars. Lorikeets are an exception. But we want a sugar that has, we don't want spikes. For example, when I come up with a lorikeet diet, I begin with a basis that is a commercial diet. And then to that I add hand-cracked pollen. We don't heat it because we can destroy a lot of nutrients. I add coconut sugar because of the low glycemic count. And then I add some paprika for the vitamin A content. When I look at production and I look at blood values, and I look at the health of the birds, it's been very, very good. In fact, it is probably one of the most productive lorikeet collections right now. It's in Asia.
That's interesting. We had somebody asking there about a 60-40 rule.
We already asked that question. Yeah, it was about like integrating a baby to the family and like how it should.
Yeah, you always. The worst mistake that people make is they have a pet, and then they have a child, and they forget the pet and they focus on the child. Suddenly you're creating resentment.
Yeah.
Make that bird part of the family. Introduce it. Let it know. Let it become part of that baby's family.
Yeah. That's interesting. Do you have any, I just wanted to be able to share that with some of the people. Do you have any interesting stories of something you've seen in the wild?
I've seen hyacinth macaws taking snails, eating snails.
Wow.
I've seen in the Sierra La Candona in Mexico, there was a water body and the water was drying, and the scarlet macaws were literally digging small sub-pools for the fish to come in so they could take them and eat them.
Take the fish?
Yeah.
No way.
Yeah.
And
So,
they eat protein like that?
yeah. Many parrots eat protein.
Wow.
You have someone asking, so can bread be fed to macaws and conures as a supplement for fat?
So, I feed, and I think if people go do some research, I've always fed whole grain, good quality bread. You don't want to feed in white bleached flour bread. You can feed a great multi-grain bread with some nut butter. You can use, almond butter or peanut butter or cashew butter. And there's these that are available without hydrogenated oils and without sugars or without palm oil.
It should be a supplement, like once a week, maybe twice.
It's a treat, When I walk around the aviary, I always take treats. And I've done this my whole life. It doesn't matter whether I'm dealing with birds or with mammals. I always take something. And I get the bird used to it. And when the bird comes down, or the monkey, or whatever, when they come down, I have physical contact. I can see how that animal went through the night. I give it a treat. And, whole grain bread, and there are breads that are full of sprouting grains, and there I would use, because it's been cooked and it's been sterilized through the cooking process, that have nuts, that have omega-3, that have flax seeds. These are good quality breads that you can use.
Do you so with the bread, we stay away from the white flour, we head into multi-grain, and we use them as treats. That being said, they're a good way to monitor how these animals are behaving, and we've spoke about this before. Macaws and birds in the wild, they don't want to show that they're sick or they have an issue.
So when a bird is sick, why does it immediately separate from a flock? Because it does not want to attract attention. Many times people tell me, oh, the bird was attacked by the flock mates. I see this with cockatoos all the time. Oh, was the bird sick? Did it die? And then it was attacked by the others. In 1980, as I said, I was in Western Victoria, and I was looking at long-billed corellas in the wild, slender-billed cockatoos. And there was an area where they were poisoned. They'd been poisoning them because they were destroying crops. So you would see a dead bird, an agonizing bird, but maybe you would see a dead bird with a living bird next to it. And that living bird kept mauling the dead one as I walked to it. And this scenario repeated itself time and time and time. It was trying to wake it up. It wasn't killing it. The bird had died from poisoning. They had laid out poison bait. The bird was trying to wake up the dead one.
Wow. That's actually very interesting. That the fact that people always say that to me. They tell me, I can't tell, but you bring the bread to the front, you bring a treat, and if it's acting different, that might be a telltale sign that you might have an issue there.
You always give a bird a treat. If it's a pet bird, it's easy. You let it out. You give it a little bit of breakfast. You look at it. If it's an aviary bird, I walk around. It doesn't matter whether I'm at home or whether I am at a consulting project. I always take treats, and I always walk around.
So we have someone asking about plucking. Is that something you can avoid? How do you manage plucking before?
So plucking has many. There's no single answer. Part of it may be a lack of bathing. Whenever a bird plucks, I always tell people, move it to another area, create a dramatic distraction, move it to another area, start spraying it, and get a medical checkup. Many times, pain causes plucking. Pain causes chewing. So you want to go ahead and create a change in the animal's life, give it enrichment, distract it, while looking at the medical side. Many times, as I've said, the work done by Susan Club shows that pluckers have pain.
And lack of stimulation as well, right?
Yes. You know, you can't take an animal that spends, 10 hours a day playing in its environment and lock it up in a cage and not give it anything to do and expect it to be perfect.
So
I have thrown out very famous people, very famous movie stars from my house, where one came and said, oh, I want a pink cockatoo. I want it to not be dirty, not scream, to talk, not to make noise. I said, well, get a plush toy.
Yeah, right.
I will not sell you a bird. Understand that these things require time. Get into it only if you are prepared to have a child in your house that's not going to go away after 18 years, that's going to live maybe 30, 40 years.
sometimes even more than that.
Yes.
It's a big commitment.
People, it's a controversial topic, but people talk about it often, and they're like, breeding, you're kind of doing this and doing that to the bird, and I don't think that they understand that in the wild, a very small percentage of them actually make it. If anything, you are preserving species, you are giving them more of a chance than they would have somewhere else.
I have been involved in release programs. And one case, many years ago in Colombia, they released a bunch of confiscated macaws. And the macaw's taken, here comes a hawk and picks off the first one. Nature is cruel. Nature consumes a lot of birds. When you release birds, you have to expect that a large percentage will get killed. Nature is not this perfect environment. It's not the utopian world that we think it is. That's one. I think sensible captive breeding has a valid point. Do I believe there is a major crisis like some of these rescues are claiming? No. I think that Emily Trimnall did some research some years ago, and it was a tiny fragment of the birds that ended up in rescues. How many children end up in up for adoption?
Yeah.
How many dogs get turned away? How many elderly get discarded in a nursery, in a nursing home, sorry. So, nothing in the world is utopian. I think that if you have birds that you have reared properly, they will live a very happy life. I know birds that I've reared 30 years ago that still recognize me. Hedy Megala had a bare-eyed cockatoo that after 30 years saw me, it immediately started to beg like a baby. He wanted to let me know that he recognized me.
Well,
as
he
his
remembered
ancestor.
you after all those years.
And the bird had not done that. So they're very smart. Rear them properly. Don't do an impulse buying. Parrots are not for impulse. You need to get into it the same thing as having a child, adopting a child. You don't run. You don't come out of your mother's womb and run. You have to go through an evolutionary phase. Start with a cockatiel, a dusky conure, something small. You don't go from having no experience to wanting a scarlet macaw or a hyacinth or a palm cockatoo.
Correct.
Yesterday I got a message from a lady. I would like a male red-tailed black cockatoo, and he's got to be friendly, and he's got to play with my kids, and I don't want him to make too much noise because my husband works out of the house. Get real, lady.
Yeah.
First of all, I wouldn't sell you a bird when you're telling me all this, because you want a machine. You don't want a living, breathing, sentient being.
Correct. Yeah, which is what people think. They sometimes make impulsive buys, and then we blame the breeder, we blame the system, or the programs that are going on, when really it's people that are making the mistakes, and we're not understanding it. Blue-throated macaws, at some point, correct me if I'm wrong, there was a very small population of them, right? And captive breeding in the United States has brought back, a very large portion of them, and
There's more in captivity than there are in the wild.
yeah,
And, we need to understand that many of these birds will be gone from nature. I was just, in Bali, and I've been working on a cockatoo book for a number of years. I always take 30 years to finish a book because I am a Virgo. I am the most anal person you ever want to see. I weigh, I verify, I re-verify, I come up with a theory, I have to prove the theory. If not, I go back, I start all over. Because there's so much misinformation that when I die, at least I can say what I know is accurate is being shared.
yeah. We have any more questions?
Yeah, so we have one. Elise is asking, what is your opinion on spirulina as a veggie topper, and how it improves, immunity, further health? And
So yes, I like things like spirulina.
Yeah.
I like pollen. I think it is certainly something. Algae has huge nutrient value, and I think that if you can properly mix it, a lot of people dump it. It just sticks to the food, and then the birds don't eat it. You need to figure out a way of incorporating it in.
Algae.
Spirulina, for example.
Oh, interesting.
So yes.
Anybody else there?
No, that's pretty much it.
Well, I think we covered a lot of points, a lot of topics. Thanks everybody for who tuned in.
I thank you for listening. If you listened to this thing, look, all that I ask you is if you're going to get into a pet, think about it. If you want a pet bird, think about it. Do your research. Verify the source of your information. Look at the credibility of your supplier. Where you're getting your bird from. Do some background work. This isn't just going in to your grocery store and picking up a candy bar off the shelf.
Yep.
You are adopting, you're bringing into your home a bird that will be with you a number of years. It's not hundreds of years, it's not 100 years, but it will be many years. A cockatiel can easily live 25, 30 years. A budgie, 15 years. A macaw, the average span is 45, 50 years. So, understand that they can live a number of years, that they require attention, and that you can't let the novelty wear off after 3 months. You don't relegate it to the garage. It becomes a family member, and you have to treat it as such.
Thank you for being on the podcast, Tony, and it was a pleasure.
Thank you.